Since the dawn of the R rating in the 1980s, it's been a more limited stamp on a film's box office prospects. There's a much lower box office ceiling on R-rated movies than there is for those of the PG-13 variety, and thus Hollywood doesn't normally back R-rated ventures with the big budgets that accompany your standard PG-13 franchise starter. That said, some R-rated films still manage to break out in a big way regardless of budget, striking a chord with audiences that spurs repeat business and strong word of mouth. Deadpool was one such film, standing as the first R-rated superhero movie programmed against the glut of Marvel Cinematic Universe and DC Cinematic Universe efforts, which regularly aim to cross the $1 billion mark. Deadpool's success caught everyone by surprise, going on to gross over $780 million worldwide. It was a success story, full stop, but it's far from the only R-rated success story. What follows are the highest-grossing R-rated movies of all time, ranked according to their worldwide box office earnings. Number 20, The Intouchable. There's a good argument to be made that The Intouchable shouldn't even be R-rated, as it's overall pretty clean by the standards of such a rating. It's got some profanity, though not all that much, alongside some depictions of medicinal drug use. It's emotional, sure, but most R-rated movies go much further, and The Intouchable proves relatively gentle. It follows the bond between an unlikely pair of people, one an older man who's become a quadriplegic, and the other a younger man who ends up working for him as his caregiver. It's sentimental and quite charming in a way that unsurprisingly had mass appeal on an international scale, becoming one of the best foreign movies of the 2010s. It made most of its money outside America, grossing just $13,182,281 of the almost $500 million it made, domestically. Number 19, Saving Private Ryan. Steven Spielberg's ode to World War II veterans, Saving Private Ryan, famously lost the Best Picture Oscar in a close call, but the film was a bona fide box office smash right in the heart of the summer movie season. It's one of Spielberg's very best movies, which is genuinely saying something when talking about the filmography of one of the best American directors of all time, someone who's also directed Schindler's List, Jurassic Park, Jaws, and Raiders of the Lost Ark. It famously opens with a depiction of the harrowing landings at Omaha Beach, and eventually shifts gears to follow a group of U.S. soldiers tasked with recovering the titular Private Ryan. It's an iconic war movie that showcases the harshness of World War II while celebrating the heroism of the individuals who took part, and was a deserving critical and box office hit. Number 18, Demon Slayer, Kimetsu no Yaiba. The movie, Mugen Train, like the aforementioned The Intouchable and several soon-to-be-mentioned movies, Demon Slayer, Kimetsu no Yaiba, the movie, Mugen Train earned most of its considerable box office gross outside the U.S., though its domestic earnings certainly weren't bad. With just under $50 million earned in the U.S., about 10% of that worldwide gross came from America, which is pretty substantial for an animated movie made in Japan. Perhaps that speaks to the popularity of Demon Slayer as a franchise, and one that skyrocketed in popularity within a short amount of time, first being a manga series from 2016 to 2020. Having a TV series that aired between 2019 and 2024, and then having several films released throughout the early 2020s. Of those, Mugen Train has been the biggest hit, and it also has the distinction of being the highest-grossing movie of 2020. Number 17, Terminator 2, Judgment Day. Director James Cameron has made two of the greatest sequels in history, and while Aliens performed decently at the box office, Terminator 2, Judgment Day was an event film of the highest order in the 1990s. His PG-13 movies have fared even better at the box office, with Titanic being the highest earner of the 1990s, Avatar being the highest earner of the 2000s, and Avatar, The Way of Water being the highest earner of the 2020s as of 2024. Still, the accomplishments of Terminator 2, Judgment Day shouldn't be overlooked, as an R-rated movie making more than $500 million is genuinely impressive, and that's not even adjusting for inflation. It delivers great action, a compelling time travel-related story, and some absolutely groundbreaking special effects that still hold up more than 30 years on from release. Terminator 2 is a textbook example of how to make a great R-rated blockbuster. Number 16, The Mermaid. Just over $3 million of The Mermaid's total gross came from the US, so just a crumb or two of the $525 million it made worldwide. Still, that qualifies it as the highest-grossing romantic comedy of all time, regardless of rating. But it's also a wild fantasy movie, being about a man falling in love with a mermaid who's been told to assassinate him. It's strange stuff, but it clearly hit a chord somewhere and with some people. Internationally, though, the film's director, Stephen Chow, is probably better known for the similarly wild comedic action films he's directed and starred in, including 2004's Kung Fu Hustle, a wonderfully strange martial arts film, and Shaolin Soccer, which blends slapstick comedy, martial arts, and sports movie tropes. Number 15. The Revenant. The success of The Revenant probably speaks to Leonardo DiCaprio's pull as a movie star in an era where there seem to be fewer of those compared to decades past. Make no mistake, it's still a very good film that would have likely generated some buzz had it not starred DiCaprio, but it's exceedingly brutal, grim, and sometimes quite slow in ways you might not ordinarily associate with box office success. The Revenant hits the ground running with a fairly stunning opening sequence, and then becomes something a little more intimate and even psychological, telling a story about survival and a desperate quest for revenge. It's the kind of film you'd be tempted to call not for everyone, but it was apparently a film for many people, going by its earnings and later success at the Oscars. Number 14, Detective Chinatown 2. You might not recognize the name Detective Chinatown 2 the same way you might recognize names of other popular crime movies, but it was a huge hit in China. Its popularity was large enough that, for a time, it was even the fifth highest-grossing movie in China's history, and an even bigger hit than its predecessor, 2015's Detective Chinatown. Detective Chinatown 2 takes place in New York City, and has a premise concerning a strange competition among detectives who've achieved worldwide fame. Essentially, each competes for a massive reward that will be given to the detective who can find the identity of a murderer still at large. For as successful as it was, it's not even the highest-grossing Detective Chinatown movie yet. More on the winner in a bit. Number 13, American Sniper. Filmmaker Clint Eastwood's story of true-life marksman Chris Kyle, American Sniper, was an unlikely holiday smash, opening in limited release in December before really exploding upon wide release in January, so it technically made most of its money in 2015. It's a solid movie that doesn't really rewrite the book on how to make a biographical movie, but it somehow struck gold and was a surprise hit, one of those movies that was expected to do well, perhaps, but wasn't exactly expected to do so well. Purely domestically, American Sniper performed better than any other 2014 movie, and that was in a year that saw the release of some amazing PG-13 blockbusters, principally, Guardians of the Galaxy and Captain America, The Winter Soldier. It was a fairly downbeat and straightforward film that suggested there was still room for more mature and less action-packed fare at the box office. Number 12. Ted. Family Guy creator Seth MacFarlane stepped into the feature realm with a raunchy comedy about a talking bear named Ted, and audiences, especially internationally, turned out in droves. Curiously, the 2015 sequel Ted 2 grossed a whopping $300 million less than its predecessor, and was therefore a massive disappointment. Recent years have seen a slight resurgence for the property, though, with a well-regarded TV prequel series coming out in 2024. It's pretty simple stuff, as far as comedies go, with most of the laughs being mined out of the premise that is, wouldn't it be funny if a teddy bear swore, talked about anything, and took drugs? Audiences did find that pretty funny. Less so in 2015, with a sequel that felt recycled at best and kind of pointless at worst, but any comedy, R-rated or otherwise, doing this well is a good sign, given you don't just want traditional blockbusters always dominating the box office. Number 11, 50 Shades of Grey. You know, I didn't like 50 Shades franchise due to how controversial those films were. Some might be afraid to admit or acknowledge it, but smut can sell, with 50 Shades of Grey's success showing as much. Sure, It wasn't particularly well received critically, but it didn't have to be to make money and please producers. That's just how it is. Something capitalism, something movies aren't always art and are often treated as investments for those with cash to spare. Based on the first book in a controversial series, 50 Shades of Grey also had a pair of sequels that were decently popular, though this first film from 2015 remains the highest earner. It was released the day before Valentine's Day in the US, so the people behind it definitely knew what they were doing, and the biggest earners of 2015 weren't released until later in the year, either during the summer or around Christmas. And my reaction was, I am so glad those 3 50 Shades franchise have been entered in the Razzies due to how idiots making this franchise even worse. Number 10. The Hangover Part 2. While domestically The Hangover Part 2 made about as much money as the first film, worldwide it topped the original by over $100 million. This is all the more impressive when you consider the pretty scathing reviews this sequel made. Although 2013's The Hangover Part 3 fell prey to a Matrix Revolutions-esque situation and grossed only $112 million domestically. Still, that hasn't dampened the prospects of a fourth movie potentially happening, at least Bradley Cooper seems keen. The Hangover Part 2 is very much a step down from the first, having a similar premise but taking things to darker and more uncomfortable areas. It crosses lines in ways that aren't as funny as the instances of line crossing were in the first movie, and the money suggests this second film soured The Hangover overall in the eyes of many, owing to that less impressive gross for the third film. Number 9, Logan. Spurred by the success of the R-rated Deadpool, 20th Century Fox allowed director James Mangold and star Hugh Jackman to finally go fully R-rated with Wolverine's final, at the time, send-off, and audiences responded enthusiastically. The film even garnered an Oscar nomination for Best Adapted Screenplay, and the choice to go R-rated paid off, with Logan being arguably the best X-Men movie so far, and probably Mangold's best effort as a filmmaker, too. Logan is exciting and has a decent amount of action, sure, but it's also stripped back and very personal by superhero movie standards. It's easy to get wrapped up in it emotionally, and though the existence of Deadpool and Wolverine means the farewell to Wolverine wasn't as final as initially seemed, the film still has an impact when watched all these years later, and feels like a high point for R-rated comic book movies. Number 8, The Passion of the Christ, another controversial movie from Mel Gibson. Filmmaker Mel Gibson's gruesome take on the death of Jesus Christ should probably have been rated NC-17 for the sheer intensity of gore and violence on display, but it didn't seem to affect box office earnings. This film was a massive hit fueled by a grassroots campaign that targeted religious viewers across the country, perhaps finding the level of intensity and violence bearable because of the biblical tale being told. Gibson had directed a violent film set in historical times before, with Braveheart, which found more critical and awards success upon its release, but didn't touch The Passion of the Christ when it came to the box office. This 2004 movie remains a challenging and oftentimes nauseating watch, but supporters of the film would argue that it's staying true to the brutality of the story, and perhaps even that the violence drives home Jesus Christ's sacrifice even more. Number 7, Detective Chinatown 3. Forget it, Jake, it's Detective Chinatown once again, with the third film in this series being the biggest hit at the box office of the bunch, at least to date. Detective Chinatown 3 changes the setting up by taking place in Tokyo, though the premise might sound a little more familiar, given it involves another competition between detectives to find the perpetrator of a crime. As to the mystery of why Detective Chinatown 3 was rated R in the first place, it was apparently a little too violent for the MPA to rate it PG-13, but it's otherwise fairly mild stuff that doesn't hold a candle in terms of violence to something like the aforementioned The Passion of the Christ. But, like the other Detective Chinatown movies, the R rating wasn't a hit on earnings, owing to the fact that it made just about all of its money outside the US. Number 6, It. When it scored the highest opening weekend for a horror movie ever, folks knew this was going to be big. No doubt fueled by the success of the similarly 80s set coming-of-age hit Stranger Things, This Stephen King horror adaptation ended up outgrossing Warner Bros.' own superhero crossover event Justice League. It was also a straight-up better movie than Justice League, which was at least redeemed with 2021 Zack Snyder's Justice League. It also ended up being the first part of a duology, with the second chapter generally not being considered as good, and it didn't turn as much financially. Still, it's good to see horror doing well alongside comedies and other non-action movies, and it's also positive to see enthusiasm for a work of horror that's not PG-13. Number 5, The Matrix Reloaded. The anticipation surrounding The Matrix Reloaded was absolutely massive, and this rare R-rated blockbuster, carrying a budget north of $150 million, indeed brought a lot of folks to theaters. But the curious story regarding Reloaded is how it completely turned people off the franchise, to the point that the trilogy closing The Matrix Revolutions, which hit theaters just 6 months later, only grossed a little over half of what Reloaded made. To be fair, The Matrix Reloaded was a good deal better than Revolutions, because even if the story in the second Matrix film got a bit muddled, the action scenes still delivered in spades. It's a little unusual that the original Matrix film was outgrossed by its sequel, but taking into account physical media sales and the like, it could well be that The Matrix remains the most successful, and, without it, there wouldn't be sequels to exceed it in box office gross, of course. Number 4, Deadpool. The success of Deadpool came pretty much out of nowhere and is even more impressive when you consider the movie opened in February, which is a month not usually known for launching blockbusters. The film surpassed any and all expectations and made a household name out of the titular character, who went from being a moderately popular comic book figure to a recognizable cinematic anti-hero overnight. As for the story, Deadpool is pretty slim in that regard, focusing more on delivering gruesome action scenes, crude humor, and plenty of instances of ridiculing superhero movie tropes and conventions. It was a working formula that kicked off a series, and the success of later R-rated superhero movies likely have Deadpool to thank, in one way or another, for showing that they could be released theatrically to great success. Number 3, Deadpool 2. It's hard to coin a winner out of Deadpool and Deadpool 2. With both being more than solid superhero movies that delivered similar goods in comparable ways. Deadpool 2 doesn't feel lazy, by any means, but it is one of those sequels that's just sort of the first film, but more, and definitely a little bigger/beefier when it came to budget and action. Deadpool 2 also makes use of the fact that it's a sequel and can therefore poke fun at the concept of follow-ups, and the ways that sequels are safe bets and sometimes prove uninspired. It's more self-aware, snarky nonsense, but it's also kind of fun and still felt relatively subversive back in 2018. A decent amount of time has passed between 2018 and 2024, though. Perhaps enough for there to be more anticipation for a third movie, this time with Wolverine. Number 2, Oppenheimer. Something quite wonderful happened in the summer of 2023. There had been anticipation building for Barbenheimer, the name given to the event that was Barbie and Oppenheimer releasing on the same day. Conversations had, prior to the release, often been about which film would perform better, and which might get shafted, but neither pushed the other away. Instead, they worked in tandem, and both proved hugely successful. Once the dust had settled, Barbie earned more money, but Oppenheimer earned more Academy Awards, and a lot of money for an R-rated movie. And an unnerving 3-hour one, at that. Both films won. That was the rather wonderful thing about the whole phenomenon, and audiences won, too, getting two great movies that were great in very different ways. Such a captivating and popular double feature brought about by shared release dates might not ever happen in quite that way again, but those who were there for it in 2023 will agree that it was great while it lasted. Number 1 and lastly, Joker. There was always a good chance that Joker would perform well at the box office, but few could have anticipated it doing as well as it ultimately did. To date, it's the only R-rated movie to earn more than $1 billion at the worldwide box office, and even if it's joined by others in time, it'll always have the distinction of being the first R-rated movie to hit such heights. It's a somewhat familiar feeling film, especially for anyone who's a big fan of Martin Scorsese's filmography, but the intensity and darkness of it all is admirable, and Joaquin Phoenix's lead performance was remarkable. Whether its sequel can reach the same heights remains to be seen, but for now, Joker stands at the top of the pack for R-rated movies at the box office. Well, that'll do for this video for today. If you guys want to see the full list of highest grossing R-rated films, go to Wikipedia. I'll end this video.